One of the things that I like about the BeeCon is that you can find people coming from the US, like Bindu is, and people coming from Australia, like he is. And not only, it's interesting because not only because you have people from all over the world, but you have experienced developer also showing things. This is the case of this presentation about our strictly practical solution. So thank you for being here first of all, because it's a long journey. So let's leave the mic for this introduction from Peter Lesty.
Thanks. So, g'day everyone. I'm Peter Lesty. I'm the technical director and part owner of a company called Parachute. We are an Alfresco-based, an Australian-based Alfresco partner. While a lot of things in Australia are poisonous, I am not. So come say hi at some stage if you haven't already. So today I'm going to be talking about two-way synchronization with Apache Camel and Alfresco. Now this is actually mostly around one of the projects that we've done recently involved in regional, cross-regional instances of Alfresco, but I do actually go into a bit of the detail around how we actually built up, what some of the issues we found, and some of the best practices if you are to use Camel in your own environment, and a quick demo as well at the end of it. So what is the problem we are trying to solve? Well, we do get a lot of issues around synchronization of Alfresco and other systems. Most of our clients who come to us will normally, a lot of our clients actually don't have Alfresco. A lot of them we actually help implement and do projects around change management, training, all that sort of stuff. But it's the first time they've seen Alfresco. But what they do have is a lot of legacy databases and file systems and other applications that need to be migrated or synchronized across. Sometimes that application that they're using is still in production, and we need to have our Alfresco up and running so people start using that, but they still need to use the old application. So synchronization becomes a very important aspect of a lot of the projects we run. So I'll talk about the main scenario today, which is two-way sync, but there's also two other scenarios that this sort of solution can apply to. So the first scenario is two-way synchronization with Alfresco. What we want to do is we want to sync a selection of nodes between instances. So we're not talking about the whole repository. We don't want to limit this to just folders and files. So if you have sites with data lists and wikis and comments on documents, we want to make sure that they synchronize across too. We want to synchronize document locks and permissions. So if there's a permission of a document that changes, it needs to be the same for both things. And we want to make it partition resilient, which means that if there is a drop-in connection, which there is if you have two instances on the other side of the world to each other, it's still going to work in some capacity. So we're aiming for an AP system for those that understand theory. Another solution that we had to do is around content synchronization. We had a proprietary Oracle database with a file-based content store. We need to sync that and get that information into Alfresco. And then at the other end, we want an external Solr instance that isn't coupled to the schema that Alfresco provides, the embedded Solr, for geospatial and a public-facing search interface. And then the last sort of solution that we've tried to target is around Cersei Dynamics and synchronizing between Alfresco and Cersei Dynamics, which is a LMS. We don't sync content, we're just syncing metadata here. But one of the interesting things about this particular project that we did was Mark 21 is quite difficult. I don't know if anyone knows about Mark 21, but it's subfields and all sorts, so it doesn't quite align with the content model that is in Alfresco. So, what's Apache Camel? There's actually been a lot of talks and a lot of pictures of camels in talks at this conference. So I'm sort of glad that other people have picked up on it as well. It is actually quite a nice framework. What does it do? It is an enterprise integration pattern framework. It's not a full-blown enterprise service bus. So in and of itself, it is not an ESB. You can combine it with things like service mix and then turn it into an ESB, but by itself it isn't an ESB. There's 100 plus existing components, so file systems, JDBC connections, seamless REST, JMS, all sorts. Now, with routing and with Camel, you can actually have that embedded in something like Alfresco. I think Alfresco already has Camel, all the libraries there, so you can actually spin up and create some routes inside Camel, and it's used for a couple of things. I think in the media management they use Camel and ActiveMQ there. So you define a route using a DSL, and that could be XML, it could be Java, it could be Ruby.com, and there's a couple of other ones as well. And that route pretty much says, okay, from one file system or one system, we want to get some information, we want to do something with it, we want to split, we want to merge, we want to apply enterprise integration patterns, and then we want to send that to a system. So normally that's what the route configuration does. You can have multiple routes per Camel context. You can have things like JavaScript to actually change things as it goes through. You can have custom components and beans. Because one of the DSLs is actually Spring and Blueprint, you can actually have custom beans inside the route, so you can actually say, okay, from the file system, then call this Java bean class, do some translations, move through, and then continue on with the route. And it's open source, which is great. We have a recommended stack. This may or may not work for you and your use case, but if you're going to use Camel in sort of an integration capacity, I'd suggest using Apache Camel, which is an OSGI container, so you can do things like hot deployment. Audio, which is a web console, so if my demo's working, hopefully we'll be able to see that. For the DSL, Blueprint. So Blueprint's a bit like Spring XML. It's an OSGI diaphragm, very similar to Spring, but OSGI focused. It's quite easy to install all this stuff. You just download Carafe and run these few commands here, just install Camel and Audio, and off you go. So what does our route configuration look like? Well, basically what we want to do is we want to have two routes at either end of Alfresco. We want to consume information from Alfresco somehow. We want to filter that out. We want to add a prevent echo filter, and then we want to produce that information elsewhere. So there is a bit of things that have to happen as the route goes through, but they're pretty much the main steps. We pretty much just want to be able to drop a Blueprint XML in the Carafe deploy folder and have it just do its thing. But we also want to deploy it to both sides, just in case one side goes down. So we made more Camel pictures. We made a component for Camel. We actually investigated CMIS and CMIS changelog, but there are a few deficiencies in actually using that. So we've actually had to build our own component. This treats Alfresco as a sequence of events, and I think a lot of the talks that we had this week were actually based on this sort of stream processing event message bus from Alfresco. This is sort of another way of doing that. We use transaction IDs. We're going to use transaction IDs to track changes. So if there's any updates to the database, that's what we'll use. We won't use something like modification times, because you can skip nodes because dates can be skewed. We want to retroactively apply it. We don't want to have to rely on the audit log. If you have like a system in production for say 5 years, you don't want the audit log back 5 years ago. You pretty much, if you don't need it, then you shouldn't be using it, because it is quite, it doesn't add a performance overhead. We want to use RESTful endpoints, so we'll create just a simple consumer endpoint, which is JSON, and all that we'll do is spit out nodes in JSON format. We want to use multi-part for producer, so we can actually do content or binary uploads. We want to make an item token as well. So one of the design patterns I heard about recently was the dude that made BitTorrent. He calls it the fix everything design pattern, and the idea behind that is that whatever you submit to this function, it'll produce the same result eventually. You're trying to get something into the state of where it needs to be, but you don't really care about the nitty-gritty details of what you need to do. Like, you don't care that you need to maybe add a couple of properties or aspects, you just care if the result at the end is that. So that's sort of what idempotent does. If you have repeated events, which sometimes you do, or you have information that comes through, you want it to be processed the same way each time. And we want to potentially expand this so we don't need to rely on Camel to actually do this. So this is one of the things that we may expand in the future. So there's a couple of endpoints. This is pretty much what you need to do for a repo side. As you can see, it's just plain JSON, and all it is just an array of node events, so updates and deletes. We consider updates and creations the same, and then all of the properties serialized out into JSON format. At the other end, the consumer of Camel pretty much wants to pull that down and turn that into an exchange. So when we're talking Camel, an exchange is like a discrete message. It's like a meta, which has headers and body. So we actually include the metadata as the headers and the body as the content input stream. Producer is just multi-part form post, quite simple. We want to submit this back to Alfresco, but we tried using JSON, but there is not really a good way of actually submitting binary data in JSON. You can base64 encode it, but then that adds a lot of overhead, so it's just easy to do a multi-part form post. We optionally check to see whether the node exists at the other end. Sometimes you may be restarting a route, restarting synchronization. You don't want to upload the same file, but again, if you update it. So we do check to make sure that it's there or not. And then at the other end, this is pretty much where the main body of work comes in, which is we've got a multi-part form submission, and we need to get a node into a certain state. We need to create folders, add aspects, add permissions, all of that sort of stuff, based on the exchange that's being sent to it. And update the content. So practice and theory, that's all great in theory. What sort of challenges did we run into when we were actually going through this process? First is the users want to be able to change and configure their own synchronization. So we created an extra module which allowed them to change or adjust the nodes that were in sync from the share front end. You can actually do this just via route, and then hop deploy it, but not everyone can read XML or change Camel or understand what's going on. And we don't want all the nodes to sync across. So we create an aspect and we actually register and just subscribe to events that only have that aspect applied. We want to prevent a feedback loop. If you update a node in one Alfresco instance and that updates from the originating instance, then the originating instance is going to receive a message to say that there's been an update there. So it'll loop over and over and over again. So you need to stop that cycle at some point. So what we did is we just track changes by modification time and node UUID. But unfortunately, modification time is not always it's not always updated when changes are made in Alfresco. Things like locks or ACLs, they don't actually trigger an update. So what we actually ended up doing was actually creating a simple checksum in char of permissions and properties for each node. And we use that to track to see whether the node had actually changed. So we use things like modification lock type and version label for that. Permissions. Authorities don't exist on both instances in some occasions, which means that if you're trying to do a checksum for equivalence, it's not going to work. So we create a simple authority and make sure it's always equal. Changes, 2 permissions. So a permission change in Alfresco does not happen in a normal transaction book. There's actually a separate set of transactions in the database called ACL change set. So we actually need to track both the transaction IDs that happen and the change sets that happen in Alfresco. Version numbers. If you've ever tried to update a version in Alfresco and have that version a specific number, you can't do it with the default version service. So we actually had to adjust the version service in Alfresco to be able to say, I want version 1.2. You can always just increment up to that version, but it is a bit of a hassle to do that. The other thing is the route configuration. When we first started, we were doing a lot of development testing and starting from the beginning of time. So the very first transaction happens from Alfresco. And that's fine if you're doing development, but if you have a live production instance, it's actually going to take a bit of time to iterate through all of those transactions over and over again. So what we did is we just persisted the transaction IDs and change sets that actually happened last time you restart the route. So I'll do a quick demo, and hopefully the demo gods will shine down upon me and everything will go well. We'll see. Okay, so firstly, this is, can you guys see that? Is that okay? Yeah. This is Audio. So Audio, I think that's how you pronounce it. I tried to find pronunciation, but we'll go with that. Audio is a web front end that does Java stuff. That's what it says on its website. One of the things it does is it allows you to connect to a Camel instance and actually have a web front end for Apache Camel. This is great. A great tool to visualize what's going on if you're doing integrations and routing with Camel. So we have here what probably looks pretty complex to you guys because you haven't seen it before. A route configuration. There's some JavaScript here. So here's the first route, and it pretty much goes down. There's a couple of filters that we do that we need to apply to make sure that we keep things in sync. You can also, if you go up one, you can actually see like more of a visual route diagram. So you can actually see, so there's a number there, 32, which means that there's been 32 exchanges taking place from that particular endpoint. You can do things like trace and step through all your exchanges, so you can actually drill down and say at each point, what were my headers set to, what was my body set to, where are things going wrong. So I've got two instances set up, and unfortunately they're in Australia, so if it's a bit sluggish, that's why, because it's on the other side of the world. So we've got side A, side B, and as you can see, there's nothing in the site. So what I want to do first is just create a folder, and we'll just call that example folder. So that folder there is created on side A. Side B, we haven't enabled syncing yet, so basically nothing's going to happen. But if I actually go in syncing, it'll update the sync state, and then you can see that the folder there, if we load it, is actually loaded on the other side as well. We can upload a document here, so we'll just use a test document here. Just drag that in. And if we actually look on the other side now, we can actually see that the test document is there as well. So that's content properties we can do as well. So if we wanted to say change the title, that'll come through too. So hello from BeeCon on one side, let's check the other side. There you go, cool. All right. So looking ahead, what are we going to do in the future? Well, I want to build the AlfStream component up. I want to do some more work with it. There's a couple of updates that I want to do. First is full site synchronization. We can synchronize all the nodes and all the different types of nodes inside a site. What we can't do is tell share at the moment that the dashboard has changed. So we actually need to make sure we have a way of updating share's cache when there's a change made. We need to be able to say, hang on, invalidate the cache because we've changed the dashboard. Transaction level exchanges. There are some scenarios where we don't want to treat an exchange like one exchange per node. We want multiple exchanges, multiple nodes per exchange. One of these things is folder rules. You can't actually create folder rules without creating about 5 or 6 different nodes underneath if you actually have a look at the raw repository. So what we want to do there is actually do a transaction block synchronization. So we actually synchronize the transaction block at once. We're going to do some SaaS storage integrations. Let's talk about desktop. There's a desktop client for Alfresco at the moment, but maybe you want to use Dropbox or Google Drive. You don't want to sync the whole thing across. Maybe you just want to sync a couple of folders, what you're working on. And there's already components in Camel for these, so that probably is quite easy to glue this stuff together. So in conclusion, synchronization is a very common use case. As I specified, the 3 use cases that I showed earlier are all ones that we've had to integrate and consult against. Camel is a great platform for this sort of stuff. It is really good to actually design your integration in a standard way without having to start. You don't even really use the implementation. You can actually just write the XML and actually work through and say, okay, well, how do I want these bits to work? Carafe and audio is great for hot deployments and testing. Carafe is a really good OSGI framework. You might know under the name Service Mix. Carafe is actually pretty much like the core of Service Mix. Service Mix is pretty much Carafe batteries included. Camel is good for creating custom components. So if you have a weird use case like two-way sync, or you have some obscure legacy database, you can actually quite easily whip up a component and just reuse that. And lastly, integration is way more challenging than you think. When you start off, you're like, yeah, it's going to be easy. And then you get into it, and it's not. So, if you guys are interested, you want to talk to me about the solution a bit more, I'm around for the rest of the BeeCon. I don't know if we've got time for questions.
Yes.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you, Peter.
Do you have some questions, Peter? Yeah.
Well, I remember doing this sort of stuff for Alfresco itself, and I remember some of the problems. For example, rules would fire on the destination. For example, if you define a record, you add all properties for a record, but it's actually not defined as a record on the. So you end up with a locked document that you're trying to update and that sort of stuff. So at Alfresco, we went through various steps like turning rules on, and for example, not sending thumbnails. I was wondering if you were interested in heading down that particular rabbit hole or not.
Yeah, definitely. We've had some challenges with some of that sort of synchronization. We don't synchronize thumbnails for that reason. There are some problems with it. Just let both sides actually spin it up. So there is ways of filtering out particular nodes that are challenging, but I would say that rabbit hole is something that is almost the path well traveled for me. If that makes sense.
Hi, maybe I didn't pay enough attention or I missed something, but you said that you didn't use an audit service to track those events, right? So how do you track every change that happens in the system, like permission changes and basically everything that you want to track?
So in Alfresco, It has, well, there's two types of transactions. There's the transaction that happens when you update properties of the node, and there's transactions that happen when you update permissions. They're actually separate. How do we track them? We actually consult the database and run an SQL query. The original query we used was a bit similar to the Solid DAO. So Solid, the actual embedded Solid instance in Alfresco talks and uses some of the stuff. Like, it's almost sort of the same as what we're doing with AlfStream. So you can actually get that information out of the database, and you don't need to rely on auto service. The information's there, it's just how do you dress it up and how do you use it.
Yeah, I was just wondering how you're dealing with conflicts at the moment. If the same change happens on both sides.
Yep, so if the same change happens on both sides, it's last write wins, and because you have versioning in Alfresco, there's two versions of the document. So if there are conflicts, in our particular use case, because I think they're in different time zones, there's not too many conflicts that come across. But if you are worried about that, then that's why you lock the document, so you can actually, it's more of a user thing, but basically lock it and make sure that comes through.
We have time for more questions.
Hi, I was just wondering about large content, maybe I missed what you said about content, but say you've got files that are gigabytes, what would you do, how does it perform?
Obviously, we are limited by network I/O, and what we want to do is prevent any repeat events from happening, so any duplication of transfer of large files. So you are very limited by your network bandwidth. So if you actually have too much information being transferred in one instance and you don't have the bandwidth to apply it in the other instance, we will actually take a while to catch up. But because of the way that we've sort of structured it, it is always eventually consistent. So there's always a bit of a delay. Maybe it's 100 milliseconds. So it'll just run it through and then catch up where it can. So if there is large files and things like that, we can't avoid transfer. One of the things I did look at is doing Delta updates and things like that, using maybe like an rsync type approach. Haven't really had the need for it just yet, because most people have enough bandwidth for this sort of stuff we're using for simple documents and things like that. I think it's going to become more of an issue where people are trying to synchronize terabyte video files or something like that. In which case you would actually want to do delta syncs or data syncing of binary content.
More questions? Okay, I think it's been a long journey, very interesting talk. Thank you, Pete. 30 minutes now break. Thank you very much. We are perfectly in time. 30 minutes for break.